Hi guys, what I want to talk about today is the subject of revisiting your old games and making improvements on them as you gain in your own sort of skills over time. So I actually have notes today, something that I've written down. So the reason I've recording this video is that I found myself going back and playing some of my old games for some reason. So in particular, I fired up my very first Unity game, Toasty Tumble. So this I created back in March, and for context, we are now late November. So it's quite a few months ago. I've made several games since then, and obviously my skills have improved. And as I've been working on my latest game, I've learnt quite a lot of stuff, and there are certain things that I put in my latest game, and I remembered that, oh, I wanted to do something like this in that first game, that Toasty Tumble. And I remember that at the time, I have a kind of like a tool online where I write down all the various features that I want to do, and I had a whole bunch of things that I knew I wanted to put in the game, but I just did not have the skills for at the time. So back then, I told myself, okay, well, I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to come back to this game and I'm going to improve it later on. And then a similar kind of thing has happened for most of the other games that I've made. You know, I've come to a point where it's like I have to decide where I'm going to stop working on it. But there's always more I want to do with it. And I think with a game or anything that's sort of creative, I imagine artists that do painting or whatever have the same problem. When is it finished? You know? So for me, I find it quite easy to come to a point where I'm saying, right, it's finished. But it's whether or not I'm going to go back and work on it. And I made a decision today that no, I am never going to go back and revisit those old games, even though I know I have the skills to be able to make them much better. So just looking at my notes, I have several reasons for this. So one of them is that for me personally, this isn't probably the case for most people. I tend to make lots of very small games. So as I said, I've only been doing this for a few months, but I'm already on my seventh game. I'm going to have to go and pause this because my washing machine is beeping at me. Hold on. Okay, the washing machine has been silenced. What was I saying? Yeah, I've just been working on my seventh game. Now, if I was to start going back over my previous games every time I learn something new, this workload is just going to grow exponentially. You know, I've got a plan to make remakes of pretty much all of the old sort of classic games like Frogger and Tetris and Missile Command and Defender and all sorts of games like that. I probably want to make about 20 little games around those kind of lines. And so again, if I was to go back to all of those games and start improving on them as my skills improve, it's just going to be never ending. But the other reason for me, which I think is probably the bigger, more important one, is that I've realised that as I look through my itch page where I've got all of the games hosted, and I kind of like play through the games, I can see the progress. It's actually quite interesting to go back on those early games and look at just how crappy it is. Because now, you know, several months on, several games on, I can see and feel that I'm improving. And I think I want to keep that as like it's almost like I'm building my own little nostalgia of my game dev. I mean, I am. That's why I started this channel, because I wanted to be able to capture the process. It's like I know that these early stages, these early games where I'm learning, it's so much fun. I want to capture it all, and I want to be able to look back, you know, in the months and years to come, and just look back on what I've done and how far I've come, and be able to see that progress from game to game to game to game. So this does pose a kind of a question again as I'm going forward, you know, how far do I go with a certain game? So for the game I'm working on at the moment, it started off as being just a game for a game jam, which is now finished, and the game is nowhere near complete yet. I had to submit rather a very unfinished and buggy game, but I do want to carry on working on it. But how far do I go with it? I don't know. That's something that I think I have to just make the decision of at the time as I'm going through the game. But I now know that once I say, okay, this is finished, this is all I'm doing for now, even if there's more that I could do to it, I know that once I make that decision, that's it. I'm not going back to that game ever again. So one thing that I talked about in a previous video, I was thinking about, do I want to go back and continue working on one of my previous games, which was the first Game Jam game, Astroworlds? And I kind of came to the same conclusion. What I should have done in hindsight is carried on working on it at the time. As the Game Jam was ending, I should have taken on board all of the feedback that I had. I had a ton of great feedback as a result of the jam, because it's actually a really big jam. There's about 3,000 participants. And I should have used it at the time and carried on. But now I feel like I just can't go back to that game. I feel like I'd kind of like be going back in time, and I would want to rewrite it. And that's basically what I would do. If I was ever going to resurrect that game, it would be version 2, Astroworlds 2, with a whole load of new features and just designed in a different way from the ground up, you know, based on what I now know. So I'm just be interested to know what your take on this is. How do you feel about this? You know, are you somebody that has a lot of small projects? I mean, this is something also that I find quite interesting on Itch, is I quite often find other developers that have lots of small games, particularly people that do jams. You know, I've seen people on Itch with like 40, 50, 60 games, and I'm just like astounded as to how they can produce so many. But of course, if they're entering a lot of game jams, which were only specifically the short ones, which were only 3 days, you know, you could pop out a game a week. But then, of course, there's other people that are spending much longer time on a game that's a real labour of love, that's taking, you know, months and months, sometimes even years to work on. So, of course, for those kinds of people, this is kind of a moot point, because moot point, because you're not going to go back to a game that you did, you know, years ago. So yeah, I'd be interested to know how you feel about this, what your approach is, you know, what do you do about this kind of thing? How do you know when your game is finished? Do you want to go back to it? Do you keep a log of all the things that you want to do in the future? How do you feel when you look back on your old games, and how do you feel about that? So that's all I wanted to say for this video. That's all I've got. This video is going to be part of like a series that I'm doing, which is kind of just the talking head type stuff, kind of talking about game development and thinking about it, not so much any of the technical stuff. So let me know if you like these kinds of videos. I'm probably going to do, I've got a few ideas for several of them that I might put out there. All right, that's all I've got for this one. Thanks very much for watching, guys. See you next time.